Today we're going to take a look at some of the Aladdin and Lion King games that were released in the 90s during the 4th generation of consoles. Disney has just released a collection containing a few versions of each, though there's a few ports from back in the day also not included. I'm going to start with reviewing the Disney Classic Collection itself as a whole, and then cover the ports of these games that released back in the day. The ports were primarily on handhelds or older platforms, so they aren't exactly superior experiences, but they did make the games more accessible by being available on more platforms. Although, some ports of these games were left out, so are the ports found in the collection the best possible picks? Or are they more here for the sake of preservation? Let's get started. The collection was developed by Digital Eclipse and contains the Virgin-published Aladdin and Lion King games. No Capcom. The Aladdin games include the Sega Genesis version, a trade show demo of the Sega Genesis version, Final Cut, and the Japanese version. And the bonus games are the Game Boy and Super Game Boy version. And if you don't know, Super Game Boy just means that it has some color. For the Lion King, we have the Super Nintendo version, the Sega Genesis version, and the Japanese version. And the bonuses include the Game Boy and Super Game Boy version. Everything is presented at 1080p and at their original frame rates. The collection has a watch feature, and if you've never seen one of these in a collection before, you're essentially watching the gameplay itself and then you take over when you want to. There's a rewind button where when you press the left shoulder button, the game will start rewinding smoothly for a bit. With saving and loading, you do get a single save state basically, so the rewind button will come in handy. You can remap all of the buttons for every game, including rewind. The default bindings also fixed an issue with the Game Boy bindings, where attacks were bound to start and select. We'll talk more about that later. You can set the in-game settings before starting the games up and also enable invincibility and even a level select. However, using the level select disables achievements. And also achievements are even in the Switch version. There's language settings and a museum. The museums contain behind the scenes and Q&A videos, a myriad of cutting room floor concept art and text commentary on a ton of art, and even art for the movies, style guides, and reference pieces. The soundtracks are also included specifically for the main games with shuffling and repeat options. So for your aspect ratio options, you've got a sharp screen option, a full screen option, and a stretch option. And your filters include a TV filter, a monitor filter, and an LCD filter. And the LCD filter is more befitting of the Game Boy games. Now, one of the more important reasons for a filter for these games would be to help with the dithering used in the Genesis games. The Genesis utilized dithering since it wasn't capable of as many colors as the Super Nintendo, but under a real CRT, dithering helps create the illusion of those extra colors and effects such as transparency. So in this regard, the filters do help a little, but it is still a preference. And lastly, the border can be toggled on and off. Now let's take a look at the games here and all of their previous ports, starting with Aladdin. Aladdin had two different developers and are totally different games between the Genesis and Super Nintendo releases, and this was some fuel to the fire that was the old Sega vs Nintendo rivalry.
What Nintendo?
The Genesis version was published by Virgin Games and contained hand-drawn characters and animation crafted by Disney animators of the time, and it was developed in-house at Virgin Games. This is regarded as the more popular version. It was the third best-selling Genesis title, and it was programmed by David Perry, who you might know from Earthworm Jim. Aladdin wields a sword and apples to fight enemies. Level design is focused more on achieving specific objectives and taking out enemies. The story takes liberties from the source material, and the plot is changed a bit for the sake of more levels and more action going on. Jafar sends you out to retrieve both pieces of the scarab before going to the cave, and after finally escaping the cave, you go right back to Agrabah to fight Jafar. Real quick, I think I should mention that the Japanese version is seemingly unaltered besides being in Japanese, and the genie is missing from the start. If you're more into a 2D action game, the Genesis version is more for you. Now let's look at and compare it to the Super Nintendo version released by Capcom. The reason Capcom made an Aladdin game instead of Virgin Games on the Super Nintendo was because Capcom still owned the license to make Disney games on Nintendo platforms. The Super Nintendo version focused on platforming and tight controls with no other attacks other than Goomba stomping and apples, making this more of a tame experience by comparison. As far as the music goes, it can be pretty subjective, so take a listen. The Super Nintendo version is far more faithful to the original movie, barring the random pyramid level, and both games do have bonus genie games. This isn't the most difficult game in the Super Nintendo library. These two flavors of games are your primary options. You could have a more action-oriented experience, or one more focused on parkour and platforming. Now, new to the collection, we have Aladdin Final Cut. The game explains it, so it does my job for me. Allow me to just read that. The following Final Cut version of Aladdin features bug fixes, camera adjustments, and other refinements that were not present in the original release of the game, but represent potential changes that the development team may have implemented had they more time. Now, this is pretty great considering the original game was actually developed in only a little more than 3 months. If you've gone with the collection, then you might as well play this version if it's your first time. Now this might surprise you, but the Genesis version was actually brought back to the NES. This version was developed by NMS Software and was only released in Europe. It is substantially lower quality on all fronts, less frames of animation, less music, plenty of bugs, and controls are less responsive. Many cutscenes in the Iago fight were cut. To change from your apples to your sword, you gotta press select, but it hardly ever works and is very inconsistent. Enemies have inconsistent hitboxes and their adaptation to the NES doesn't feel well thought out. The sprite limitations will make enemies and even platforms just disappear, so you could get surprised by them popping out of nowhere as you progress. There's also less enemy types, and those enemy types removed were replaced with enemies that throw daggers, so apples are a lot more important in this version. Level layouts have issues, not enough changes were made to adapt for the NES, and all the changes that they did make were just kinda poorly thought out. It may sound like I'm being harsh on an NES remake of all things, but if you really want to play an NES Aladdin, I have been seeing many people suggest Super Aladdin, a bootleg port, as a superior experience. Now since Super Aladdin is a bootleg, I'm not going to spend much time on it. It controls and looks much better, and it restores some of the original music. The trade-off though is that there are only 4 levels in Super Aladdin. If this was passed off to some kid over the official NES game, that kid might actually consider themselves lucky. Virgin Games Aladdin then arrived on the Game Boy. It was developed by NMS Software too, released in the US first and then in Europe, and holds many of the same problems, though overall I would say it is less buggy. It plays a little faster than its NES counterpart. Sometimes it's actually possible to dodge daggers accurately. The NES version already had hitbox issues, but they feel way worse here. Your sword has such a really tiny hitbox, but enemy hitboxes are crazy. But at least select reliably changes your weapon now. The Rug Ride level actually has warnings for rocks. This wasn't in the NES version since it was slow enough to react. Enemies can hit you from way off screen, but sometimes damage you take doesn't register. Now make no mistake that even though it runs faster, this game still runs really slow and clunky compared to the original. It is the Game Boy, but there's been better feeling side-scrolling games on the console before. Later on, the Virgin Aladdin game came to the Game Boy Color. This version was developed by Crawfish Interactive, and a ton of improvements were made. You can attack whenever in the air, hitboxes are a bit more consistent, enemies give you a chance to get a hit in, and there's less bugs, though there still can be some. A lot of music was restored and all of the cutscenes returned, but the Abu bonus levels and Iago fight are still cut. The Game Boy Color version feels and controls much better than the Game Boy version. The UI now shows whether you're using your apples or sword. This is overall an improvement on the Game Boy Aladdin, and after playing it, I'm surprised it's not in the collection. If you wanted a mobile version of Genesis Aladdin, this would have been the way to go. Virgin Games Aladdin also released on the DOS and Amiga, and this version used to be on Steam and GOG, but it was recently removed. While it's graphically on par with very minor differences, the music is very different. Music cues are a little buggy in this version as well. The UI was repositioned and uses an hourglass over the genie's lamp for health, and the genie's expression changes too as your health gets lower. Although this area can unfortunately cover things up, and overall there's just less screen real estate in this version. And you still have to press a button to swap between your apples and sword because of the Amiga joystick, and you can't super jump in this version. This will be a much harder version of the game to come by, and unfortunately it does suffer from screen real estate issues and overall lack of polish. Now lastly, we have the Game Boy Advance port of the Capcom Aladdin. This version featured color mode options. The default color mode is brighter like many GBA games are since the GBA didn't have a backlight. So since I'm recording and don't need that, we're gonna set it to color mode too. So this version contains extra stages and no password system. Naturally, we also have lower quality audio, and music from the movie was replaced with original scores. As a portable version of the Super Nintendo version of Aladdin, the GBA version does what it has to do, although if you play the original, you probably won't find much reason to play this version over it or to play it again. Next we'll move on to Lion King, and all of the versions I'm going to talk about were published by Virgin Games, and it was developed by Westwood Studios. And we'll start with the Genesis version. Simba has one linear movement speed and you have a meter that fills up, and when it's full, you get a more powerful roar. And once again, the Japanese version has seemingly no differences outside of being a Japanese. The Super Nintendo version controls a bit differently and it's actually pretty subjective which people prefer. I've heard both be called the faster, more responsive version. The games visually are proportionally different and the Super Nintendo version is zoomed in a little further. The differences caused by this are minor, but they still exist. And with closely comparing the two, the only mechanical difference I can confirm is that Simba jumps 1 to 2 pixels higher in the Genesis version. Once again, the music is pretty subjective, so take a listen. Honestly, the music and graphics of these games are highly subjective. These are two different tastes of the same game and it really comes down to what you prefer. So people may prefer the music of the Genesis version or the visuals of the Super Nintendo version, or the way controls feel different between the two may make a difference. It's really up in the air, but if you've bought the collection, you can just sample both and give them a shot. Next up is the Amiga version, which also used to be on Steam and GOG but was recently taken down. This version was originally developed in just 2 months, and as a result, it's missing content. The levels Just Can't Wait to Be King and Hakuna Matata, along with most cutscenes and power-ups, were removed. Again, the graphics are on par, it uses Super Nintendo sound effects, and the music is pretty different. So just like with the Amiga version of Aladdin, good luck getting a hold of this version, and even so, it's lacking content, so maybe this version wouldn't be preferable anyways. Next we'll move on to the Game Boy version. It was developed by Dark Technologies. First things first, the Game Boy version only has 6 levels and there's no cutscenes or Timon bonus game. The controls aren't as responsive, getting accurate jumps as Simba is much harder. A is to jump, B is to roar with no meter anymore, and slash is start. Stages and some enemies lack way too much detail to even recognize what you're looking at. For the most part, levels are pretty close to their original layouts, but some later levels take drastic changes. And some of those changes made, such as the ostrich ride, aren't well thought out for this game's case either. And if you didn't know, Lion King is already known to be an incredibly hard game, but the hippo tails in the Game Boy version are even worse. The gorilla boss battle is different mechanically, and also, he just becomes a regular enemy after the first level you fight him in. I found the music to be pretty grating, and a lot of it is missing, even though a bunch of the music was still in the game. It just went unused. While it's impressive to get this game on Game Boy, it can be a frustrating experience compared to the original games, along with missing levels. So later on, the Game Boy version was actually brought to the NES. It was also developed by Dark Technologies and bears many similarities to the Game Boy port. The biggest change is that the game is zoomed out, and some detection stuff is improved, although it has less music. So if you don't have the luxury of a Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis or even a Game Boy, this is what you'd get on the NES. And lastly, we have the Master System and Game Gear version. They were developed by Cyrox, and these are actually incredibly different versions of the game, so consider these a bonus. They took far more liberties with this version, so I don't really want to call them ports. The level layouts are completely brand new. While it reuses design choices made for the original, the clever level design is gone. The way that they were designed before naturally taught you mechanics, but here they expect you to know which monkeys to roar at to turn them around, since they're all the same color now. Controls in this one are odd, since Simba doesn't start off at full speed, he has to build up to it. The gorilla also starts randomly appearing in these games too. Adult Simba actually automatically attacks enemies as well, and there are new power-ups including invulnerability. All of the levels are here, but some levels are significantly shorter. These versions are a different taste, though I wouldn't consider them on par with the original versions. Now, I felt generally the original console versions of these games aged much better than their ports. I don't doubt though that some people grew up on these different versions. I know many don't like the Super Nintendo Aladdin, but that's what I played as a kid and I enjoyed it along with the Super Nintendo version of Lion King. I think the real value in having all of these versions included in the Disney Classic Collection may just have to do with the prosperity and make the cost of the collection worth it, as well as appease those who did grow up on those versions instead of the console versions. I can understand why Capcom games are missing, though I do again find it a shame that the Game Boy Color version of Aladdin is absent. I think that version would definitely be worth playing over the Game Boy version included. Feel free to comment which versions you've played and preferred though. Everyone does seem to be pretty opinionated on these games, but I hope I was able to provide information on all of them. Thank you all for watching, be sure to check out more of my comprehensive port reviews, check me out on Patreon, follow on Twitter, and I'll see you all next time.